You're listening to The Partially Examined Life, a podcast by some guys who at one point set on doing philosophy for a living, but then thought better of it. Our question for episode 376 is something like, to what degree is society supposed to make us more virtuous? And we read selections from Plato's lengthy late dialogue, The Laws. For more information about the text and the podcast, please see partiallyexaminedlife.com. This is Mark Linsenmeyer, leaving my children in abundance of awe rather than gold in Madison, Wisconsin.
This is Seth Paskin, laying the groundwork for my benevolent dictatorship in Austin, Texas.
This is Wes Alwan, drinking my way to justice in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
This is Dylan Casey, unmelted in Madison, Wisconsin.
A dialogue that we have put off for a long, long time. This Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy article that, Wes, you had found for us, that was a good summary of the whole thing, since we weren't going to read the whole thing. In its hard copy, in this translation by Thomas Pangel, is 577 pages. So obviously that's not all the dialogue, but a lot of it is the dialogue. It's, 300 some pages. So yeah, we're definitely not going to read the whole thing. And I guess it's unfinished too. Is that right? That's scholarly? Apparently
it is. Yeah. Apparently it's according to, was it Aristotle or some other commentator who thought it was unfinished? Yeah.
So this Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy article, The Laws is Plato's last, longest, and perhaps most loathed work. Mm-hmm. This is the objective. I thought it was okay, the parts that I read. I was looking at this sort of like the Kant on ethics lectures, like we're revisiting. So here we're revisiting his politics, but, it was always a question in the Republic. Is he just talking about the ideal state just to make a point about justice in the individual? Is it really political philosophy? Well, this is definitely political philosophy. Here is, let's make up the laws for a new city. Let's talk about the laws of a couple of the participants in the dialogue. If you're a Spartan, if you're a Cretan, kind of what the laws are there. Let's make up this new, ideal, but it's going to be in the real world. We can't just pie in the sky. Well, it'd be really nice if the smartest people were in charge of everything. Here, we actually have to deal with, well, how would we figure out who are the smartest people? But it seems to complement to me a lot of what we saw in the Republic.
Not only how do we figure out who are the smartest people, but we have a kind of chicken and egg problem because the laws deal not just with correction and punishment. In fact, ideally, that we wouldn't even have to do that at all. At one point in the dialogue, he says it's kind of weird and shameful that we would even go through this process of defining penalties, because if the laws are correct, everyone would be educated perfectly anyway, and everyone would be virtuous. But our institutions depend on education, and the lawgivers must be properly educated as well. The way the dialogue ends, it says, in a way, we can't create a textbook for this. We can't create laws for the process by which laws are created. There has to, in a way, be the lawgivers have to get together and kind of have like one long liberal arts seminar where they bootstrap themselves up to the point where they are properly educated and then can start legislating.
Yeah, but isn't that chicken and egg problem rooted in the fact that you need to have wise people who are implementing and leading? In that way, it sort of takes off from the Republic. In the Republic, you have the desire to have the best people, the philosopher kings who are the wisest ones who are going to rule properly, and everybody is in their place. And there is that acknowledgement that the only way people get to that place is by the right kind of education. And therefore, the best you can do to solve the chicken and egg problem is to educate people properly. But even that, isn't foolproof. So it does feel different than the Republic in this way, it's just way more practical.
Yeah. I mean, the way things go in the real world is that there's just millennia of culture and a kind of learning process, which is quasi-rational, but doesn't happen through explicit reason. So in the real world, we get an educational foundation that is very flawed, right? We have lots of unjust customs and racism and nationalism and custom that serves as a poor foundation, but has the seeds of a good foundation. And so we have a whole educational process, which is very flawed. And then ideally, that educational process bootstraps itself over time and refines itself. But ultimately what we're looking for, right? Yeah, the law is, according to this dialogue, all about creating virtuous citizens because it's only virtuous citizens who are going to be susceptible to the law anyway. It doesn't work just to compel, just to force people. This should remind us, by the way, of Korsgaard, who emphasizes the fact that command is necessary, right, for the kinds of laws we give ourselves, but we also need reflective endorsement. Plato almost just comes out and says exactly the same thing. We need ultimately penalties and compulsion, but we need persuasion. We need reflective endorsement to supplement them.
Well, right. And we should probably rewind just a second here. And the relationship between the need for virtuous citizens is about the contribution or the importance of virtue and virtuous citizens to a healthy state. Ultimately, the question is, well, what are we trying to accomplish here? What are the laws actually for? It's not to maintain order in a disordered or unruly state. And it's not to maintain a state that's the best at fighting wars or fighting off enemies, right? We're trying to create an orderly, well-regulated state that provides something important to all the citizens: stability, like a certain level of wealth, happiness, health, etc. And so, ultimately what he's saying is, in order to have that kind of a state that is actually concerned with the virtue and the constitution and the well-being of its citizens, you need to have virtuous citizens, and not just a couple of them at the top, which was kind of what we got in the Republic, but you need to have a populace of virtuous citizens.
Right. In other words, our institutions are only good as the people. And you can say this is a point that Lincoln made, right? If when people want to listen to our Lincoln podcast that we did recently, the liberalism podcast, it's one thing to say we have the institution, but it's another for it actually to persist and survive and be executed as the institution it is. And it requires certain values and certain virtues and an education on the part of the populace. Now, how widespread do those virtues need to be? That's another question. Does it just need to be a group of elites? That becomes a complicated issue. Same thing in Schiller. We've seen this over and over again on this podcast. Schiller, disillusioned by the French Revolution. There is no revolution until the populace has been educated and prepared for the revolution. If there's going to be a just society, the groundwork must be laid first in the character of individuals before it's laid in institutional realities.
So a concern to float above this, sort of as we're going through, people had asked, just reading the Republic, is Plato a totalitarian? Is he, right? We have Karl Popper wrote a whole book on how a lot of traditional philosophy, including his a whole section on Plato, is, right, the open society and its enemies is the name of the book, is anti-freedom. So that's a question. Like, apparently one of the things I read was there's some more democratic elements than you would expect from Plato, who, clearly doesn't like democracy overall in this. As a practical matter, again, we want the smartest people to be in charge. Well, we don't just know that. We can't make the kind of measures that he recommends in the Republic of getting rid of all families and putting everybody in a pool and testing them when they're babies and elevating those people. So we have to do something. We're going to have, as you were saying, Seth, an educated citizenry. So we want to have everybody involved in some ways, right? On juries, there's still obviously going to be the issue of who's going to be a citizen. It's not like, I think Aristotle follows very directly from this, that they're going to be slaves, they're going to be outgroups, they're going to be resident aliens and things that are not citizens. But in any case, we want to, so in coming up with this in the first place, though, you definitely need, he recommends, a benevolent dictator just to come up with these laws and impose them in the first place. And all these models, we haven't even really set up the dialogue. It's three characters that are on a journey and they're talking about, so an Athenian, the Athenian stranger is the one who talks most of the time, is maybe it would be Socrates. If Socrates...
Aristotle thought it was Socrates.
Yes, maybe if Socrates was the kind of person who did this kind of politics. He claims in the Apology, I don't do this kind of politics. Maybe it's Plato himself. Any case, it's, we've seen the stranger in some other things. And even though they were talking with him for 300 pages, the other two guys still call him the stranger. Like, you've met, can you ask his name some of the time? Can we just get over this? But the other two guys do have names. Again, one is from Crete, one is from Sparta, and they're comparing their laws. They're coming up with this new system. And so what they're doing basically is what somebody has to do at the beginning. And if everybody just had to join together and agree on this as a constitution, that would be very difficult. So it'd be better if we could have some sort of dictatorship to put it in place. And then, as we were just saying, we have to somehow get all the populace up to speed. So in fact, the whole purpose, one of the big theses of this book is it is the purpose of the state to make people virtuous, which is not what we would, there's no room for freedom in that. Freedom means you're going to stray from the virtuous path. We want to, especially as for young people, but throughout your whole life, the educational process should be putting you on the straight and narrow. So yeah, is this going to be the kind of thing that we want to have anything to do with, given our commitment to freedom?
I don't know if I agree with you about that it has nothing to do with freedom. And I want to think about, maybe I'm being infected by listening to podcasts about Genghis Khan and thinking about what a Spartan militaristic society would be. And the difference in what Seth just brought up is, what is the city for? And it just strikes me that it is a pretty radical notion to imagine that the city is really for the same thing that an individual ought to be, which is to be excellent as an individual. And that what it should be doing is, what the city should be oriented to doing is cultivating excellence of spirit and soul in the individual for the sake of the city, as opposed to cultivating excellence in combat solely for the defending of the city from intruders or any number of other goods, or just that the city doesn't have a good, that sort of this Thrasymachus argument regarding justice, that whoever is the strongest, a kind of Hobbesian, it's just a battle of the wills of individuals, and whoever is stronger ends up winning. That notion that our good and the good of the city is somehow tied to excellence of soul seems to me a lot to do with a notion of freedom that we would have. Now, I'm not disagreeing that, as prescriptive as it can be, it doesn't seem to run counter to our notions, what we would think of as freedom, not just normally, but just in any kind of conventional way. But
yeah, to Mark's point, it's what's called law here, which I think the Greek word is nomos, and can be translated custom as well, will sound a little bit more encompassing than we would normally think. It'll sound like it includes customs and gets very deep into not just protecting rights or preventing people from doing criminal things to each other, but regulating, so for instance, there's a marriage law that's suggested where you got to get married between the ages of 30 and 35.
Mm-hmm. And you have to marry somebody you're positively encouraged, though not required, to marry someone who's your opposite.
Right. So you get these social rules. Now, on the other hand, we do have all kinds of social rules that are enforced by social coercion, by cancel culture, which is just a prevalent part of human life. So there might be some shame in not being married, for instance. And much of the enforcement that Plato talks about in this dialogue does involve things like shaming. Now, it is more explicitly institutionalized, right, than we might be comfortable with. But I just want to point out that we do have these more informal institutions. Some things are dishonorable and will get you looked down on, even if it isn't written officially into a law. And then the other aspect of this is a lot of this is about education. And we, of course, this is a point I made on the Lincoln podcast as well. There's kind of an authoritarian element to education. So we strongly regulate the environments of children and what they learn, and in a sense, indoctrinate them, even if we're indoctrinating them to try to make them free, to try to give them the ability ultimately to think for themselves. We have to indoctrinate them with the value of think for yourself. So there's a kind of paradox there. So a lot of the dialogue is about this formative stage, whether it's in a state or whether it's a human being. And the more formative that stage is, say, in early childhood development, then the more like a dictatorship it is. But ultimately, hopefully later on, at a different developmental stage, it looks like it incorporates something democratic and something free. Now, for the most part, the word freedom, it kind of has a bad connotation in what we read. It's associated with libertinism, although he does positively talk about free doctors, right? The doctors who can give scientific explanations of what they're doing, freedom of thought, as opposed to slave doctors who are just tyrannical and in a way themselves tyrannized by habit. I'm just going to do what's in the manual, so to speak.
Slave doctor was going to be my thing. Walking slave doctor in Austin. Just that term, I think something like veterinarian would have been better because, right, the difference between the slave doctor and the regular doctors is the slave doctors just give the medication. They just do it.
Physician's assistants?
Well, just, you don't have to, you don't persuade or convince a sheep that, or a horse. You just do it. Whereas human beings have to be persuaded. So, I mean, it's just a funny metaphor analogy. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but.
So they're doctors of slaves, but then there also are probably the slaves themselves, right?
They are slaves, and they're more like assistants to the doctors who know better.
Well, and also slaves don't deserve an explanation. You don't explain to a slave why and convince them that this is the right medication or the right course of treatment. You just tell them what to do, because they're slaves.
Yeah, there's both aspects to it, right? Being,
yes.
This being a slave to the roteness or the recipe, and also the treating of slaves or, individuals who aren't making choices of their own care.
And he associates it, by the way, with the empirical, the word, some word that's, I think, translated as empirical is used, right? So you just go based on experience, or maybe the word experience is what's used. So it's correlation rather than causation. The free version of medicine understands the nature of it, understands all the scientific causes behind what you're doing. The unfree version is just, oh, this herb worked in the past. I'm going to take it again. I don't know why it works, but that's so.
Yeah, this is a very familiar Platonic thing, the techne. Oh, it's merely a techne. You don't really understand. You're just a horse trainer. But if you had, understood where horses fit in the greater animal kingdom, if you've understood how the horses are matter and how matter makes up the universe and how matter relates to energy, and the more philosophical and abstract you get, the more that you know. And so the wise lawmaker is going to have the ultimate justifications, is going to have the grasp of the form of the good that will ultimately ground all the particular information.
Yeah. Otherwise, you're a baker.
But it is, I think, made clear here that in the Republic that you do have to teach statesmen how to be statesmen. You don't just have to teach them geometry and teach them ethics, and somehow then they'll just know how to organize people to create a granary and an irrigation system. You have to actually learn those things as well. I believe there's more of that sort of detail in this book.
Doesn't, in what we read, he just says they must be taught piety. They must be taught that the soul is the oldest of all things and rules bodies. And they must be taught that the stars and astronomical, that they're basically intelligent design, that the world is built off of intelligent design, not of, materialistic determinism and necessity. And then he says, and they need to learn other subjects that precede this. And he doesn't say explicitly what that is, but I took that to be mathematics, as it often is in Plato. So he doesn't say we got to teach them math, but I think it's implied.
Well, this is not the leaders that you're talking about. I think this is everybody, right? We need everybody to be a theist, or else
I'm talking about the end
to
of the dialogue where he's talking about the council. This is explicitly the nocturnal council. Yes, everyone has to be taught that as well, but first, with great precision, more precision than anyone else, the council has to be taught this.
Yeah, let's
teach it to themselves.
Say a little more about the structure of, and I think we should save for the nightcap how we chose this 60 pages because it's good. It's a little controversial, but we found 60 pages, and it seems like a good 60 pages. So the beginning of the dialogue, they set things up. They reveal these characters. They talk a little about,
Well, can you elaborate on that just a little bit?
Sure.
Just because you gave an Athenian, a Cretan, and a Spartan walk into a bar.
Yeah.
Sorry. Now they're walking to to Knossos, where there's a temple where apparently Zeus was born. And I looked this up. You can still go there today. It's like a tourist attraction. It has 4.5 stars because someone didn't like the way the steps go down into the temple. But it's really interesting, that it's still there, and this is what they're on the way to do. And it brings up, and they're going to have, and it's a very long walk, and they're going to have this conversation while they walk. And the conversation, I think sort of pivoting off of the fact that they're going to see a sanctuary of Zeus, the idea comes up of whether or not the laws are something created by gods or human beings, which is another way of saying, is it a matter of convention and custom? Is it just relativistic? Or is there such a thing as natural law? In a way, that's the question that starts off the dialogue. And then, Mark, as you pointed out, later on in the dialogue, we learned, well, hey, one of these guys is actually about to start his own state, his own city. Coincidentally enough, Magnesia. And so we really got to work hard on figuring out how we're going to set that up.
Yeah, so this is supposed to actually parallel the walk that Minos, who came up with the laws of Crete, that he would consult with Zeus, would do this walk to consult with Zeus. So it was in the mythology of the different cities that, some one individual consulting with the god created the laws, and of course they're wonderful. So that after setting that up and talking a little bit about, again, the function of the state is to create virtue, a little about education. We then jump to book 4, which just talks about book 4 and 5, what a law should look like, and that a law should have an explanatory preface, right? You're trying to convince the citizens to obey this. And then book 9, we jumped forward to crime, intention, and punishment. So the law says, here's why you should obey this law. Here's the law. So hopefully you're convinced by that. But if you don't, we're going to punish you. And some of these laws are you should believe in God. You should believe in the gods. And so that's what in book 10 that we jump to is the theology of law. So it's an argument for the existence of God that we should be able to put right there as a prelude in one of the laws. And everybody, all the atheists, all the foolish atheists should buy it. If they don't, they're going to be in trouble. We're going to, exile them. We're going to imprison them. We're going to do something. And other crimes, if they're attacking temples, if they're irredeemable, then we should just kill them because it's just better for them. It's better for them not to exist, right? If they're so far from what the human good should be. And then we concluded with a little bit of book 12, this nocturnal council that Wes mentioned. So this is the practical substitute for that class of guardians that's mentioned in the Republic. Here, again, it's not just the guardians. Everybody has some amount of education and some amount of wisdom just to go along with the laws in the first place. But we do want people constantly, we don't want to just have a constitution that then is unquestioned. We want people who have the highest philosophical knowledge routinely evaluating these laws and their foundation to see if something should be tweaked.
Let's take a moment to talk about our sponsor for this episode, Function Health. Function is the only health platform that gives people the kind of data that they usually never get and the insights to start doing something about it. You get access to test over 100 biomarkers. For an additional fee, you can also access MRI and chest CT scans, all tracked in one secure place over time. So I have long wanted to get some blood tests which go further than the standard tests I get for my annual physical from my doctor. That includes more detailed lipid tests related to cholesterol and heart health. What I found out, though, is those tests are expensive and they're not covered by health insurance. I was impressed that with Function, for a single fee, I could just do 2 lab visits and get 100 biomarkers tested. That includes electrolytes, environmental toxins like lead, various hormones, a whole thyroid panel, and most importantly for me, a lot of heart-related tests that go well beyond what you would get for a lipids panel from your doctor. There are 15 biomarkers and just related to heart function and cholesterol alone. And what I found out from that is that I had risk factors that I did not know about just from getting my cholesterol tested at the doctor. And if you're interested in healthy aging, the insights that the Function platform can give you are really great, even beyond the results related to heart health. So I highly recommend this. Learn more and join by using our link. Function is a near 360 view to see what's happening in your body, and our first 1,000 listeners get a $100 credit toward their membership. Visit www.functionhealth.com/PEL or use gift code PEL100 at sign up to own your health. That's www.functionhealth.com/PEL. All right, with that, should we just jump in now into the dialogue?
Sure. Yeah. What else in book 1 and 2 here?
All right. So going back to book 1, so I just mentioned this beginning, which is a question about whether the laws are just conventional or come from the gods. And then the kind of second point that's made in book 1, or the section that we read, 624a to 632d, is that, well, an idea comes up from Cleinias. How are we going to pronounce all these names? Cleinias
of Knossos, the Cretan, right?
Cleinias.
And, Megillus of Sparta, or AKA the Lacedaemonian. Sparta is shorter.
The Spartans.
In my notes, their names are abbreviated as K and M and A. And then also, I don't distinguish between who's saying what. So I don't know who introduces this idea. But an idea is introduced that the laws are basically, the purpose of the laws in a city is to instill habits or virtues in people that will serve the defense of the city. I mean, ultimately will turn out to be right to make them courageous. Right? So one of them is to have people have a common mess together, for instance, and to do gymnastics. And so it's a really weird but interesting, when you think about it, idea that, because we would normally think about law in terms of internal law and order, right? What keeps people from harming each other, or, think about it in terms of ensuring rights and punishing crimes. But here, the idea is that, well, there's this state of nature, this perpetual warlike state between all cities. And we have to have laws that are going to help us defend and be victorious over other cities.
And isn't that in parallel with the observation? And I think the Athenian stranger brings this up, and then Cleinias sort of agrees with it, that you're taking the extension of the city as the arrangement that an individual soul has with themselves. And because the Athenian brings up, there's this derivation about cities to get to the problem of the relationship of a person to themselves, and that Cleinias formulates it as, well, the thing that we need to do is that the first and best of all possible victories is the victory of oneself over oneself. So sort of the enemies that you have within yourself. And so the right arrangement of one's soul and the parts of one's soul for a flourishing individual is again made parallel to the right arrangement of a city.
Where there's an emphasis on the fact that we don't want. So he drills down. He starts with, okay, so there's conflict between cities, but there's also conflicts between neighborhoods. There's conflicts between households. There's conflicts between individuals, and then there's conflicts between a person and himself. He doesn't initially put it in republic terms, between conflicts between parts of a psyche, but that's the way it sort of falls out. They're parts of people's psyches, and they are in conflict with each other. And then the idea is, do we really want them to be victorious, right? Do we need courageous warriors who are going to defeat their neighbors, or, use the rational part of their soul to defeat the passionate part of their soul? No, we somehow got to stitch the parts together and make them friends, reconcile them. So the laws have to have not just this repulsive force quality. If you're thinking about this in ontological terms, it's almost like someone asking, well, you think of it in terms of natural laws. What are they supposed to do for an entity? Oh, they're supposed to keep everything out so the entity can persist and not be encroached on and destroyed in that way. And then someone else comes along. Actually, you need internal structure, and you need something that explains why something is one thing and why the different parts cohere together and work together. And that's what this type of law is supposed to explain. And that turns out to be virtue in the broad sense. So you don't just need courage to repulse. We need all the other virtues, and they're going to help things cohere, whether in the state or in the psyche.
Right. And the way that the stranger in Socrates-like fashion convinces the other two, right? It's not just about defense. It's about, because, defense from dangers, but also defense from pleasures. That to be master over yourself is not just to not run away from the enemy, but to not uncontrollably run toward the delicious cake that you need. So it ends up, in the place around where we stopped, it goes into this part about, well, surely drunkenness is, terrible. That's, you're out of control. And the stranger is like, well, it's, let's talk about parties where you get drunk. There are good times to do it. And that is when you are basically training, and you can only do this with adults. You don't want to do this with with young people, training people to resist temptations. That if they never have any temptations, then how are they going to be defended against them? So we're going to invite people to get drunk in a controlled way, just so that they can control themselves and not drink too much. Or if they do drink too much, then they learn from that experience, etc.
Well, the idea is for them to be able to get drunk without doing stupid things while they're drunk, doing rash things. Just like if you want to train someone to be a warrior and to be courageous, you put them in a lot of dangerous situations and say, do it anyway, do the right thing anyway, even though you're terrified. Drunkenness can be used the same way. Don't give in to pleasures just because you're disinhibited. Yeah.
But again, the way part of it is the training, which is a supervised, semi-constructed circumstance. If, there is the implication that just letting people get drunk, not being supervised by sort of the right controlled situation, then you won't get the education effect that you want in the controlled way that you want.
Parents have to buy the alcohol for the children.
Well, actually, the IEP, the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry characterizes this as youth they're just energetic, right? They're just crazy, and we don't want to give them alcohol and get them drinking parties because they'll just get totally out of control, especially because that's the time you're also listening to music, which, as we know, can inflame the passions and cause all kinds of undesirable behavior. But then in the 30s, people just...
gotta police those musicians, just like in the Republic.
Definitely got to police the musicians. That element is still there. But then he said, when people get older, they just get tired and bored, and they're just dead. They're not up for partying anymore. So alcohol helps create sociability and give them the energy and the wherewithal to participate in their civic duties.
Well, so before 30, you can't have any alcohol. After 30 and up to a certain age, you can do it moderately. And then when you're old, the point is to, your passions have died down too much. We don't want to have too little passion. We need to rejuvenate ourselves. And alcohol can help us do that. That's my experience of every older person I know who drinks a lot. So youthful.
So eventually this gets to, we had a section toward the end of book 1 and then into book 2 into what is education. And I think there's a lot more of it in this book that we did not read, but it's, sort of a lot of what you would expect from the Republic. But this formulation of play games, there's a correct nature, one which, as much as possible, draws the soul of the child at play toward an erotic attachment to what he must do when he becomes a man who is perfect as regards the virtue of his occupation. So we're trying to instill habits. So much of Aristotle seems to just fall directly out of this.
You're looking at book 2 now?
No, this was the book 1, 643b that you had, page 24.
Okay.
I mean, it's developing habits and also liking the right things, right?
Yep. Make one desire education from childhood in virtue that makes one desire and love to become a perfect citizen who knows how to rule and be ruled with justice.
Yeah. And then he seems to say that, right, and this interests me because it's really about upbringing. So there's formal education and then the effects of parental interventions during early childhood development are not distinguished. I mean, later on, we'll say, for instance, you got to really set an example. But there's a lot, right, that goes on, a lot of subtle things that go on psychosocially that affect whether, the character of the children and whether or not they're going to be virtuous. So all of that stuff would have to be attended to. And the other point here that he's going to make here is that we are, and this is another point of interest to me, we're going to need to use the thumos and the related concept of honor to help regulate this. The way to regulate the passions is to counteract them with honor, which we'll get into a little more.
I just wanted to make the comment, and part of it is just reacting, Mark, you've a couple times, the sarcasm about it comes out about the regulating of people towards justice. And I get it, but what I'm partly wondering is, even if it's missing, even if it's extreme, isn't there something still absolutely clearly true that the ability that children don't raise themselves and that people don't raise themselves and that without the right structure in the right way, and we can talk about what that is, the only way you end up with, I don't know, competent people who live and work with other people is by accident.
I think competent is the good word here. That is more modern than perfect. We want to train everyone, and the whole of your education is to shaping you into this perfect model citizen. And we just don't think in those terms of, and part of it is just, it's a more cynical age and we don't think that that's possible. But I think a lot of it is also the liberalism, that this is the discussion that you guys had on liberalism. And Plato is not a liberal. Plato is, in fact, one of Wes and I on Close Reads, we read Isaiah Berlin talking about the two types of freedom. So there's the freedom from, we don't want interference by the government, et cetera. And then there's the freedom to live according to a way that, your religion, your customs, a way that you envision as being the best possible life. And I think you guys gave a good presentation that there are good ethical reasons for both of these things. Like we sort of have committed as a society to the liberalism thing. And that is why we don't think we should be imposing even on our children. I want you to be exactly this kind of person. Like, no, I want you to have the basic competence, the critical thinking skills, the generally good habits we want. I don't want you to become a drug addict. I don't want you to be drunk all the time. I want you to be able to sit and be quiet and listen to other people in a group. Like, it does require quite a lot of training. But like, once you can do those things, I want you to explore and figure out the world for yourself. And I just don't see that here.
Yeah, I think we underestimate, though, how much effort and structure that we do put into this, as cynical, and how much coercion, as cynical as we might feel consciously. So, for instance, before I got to school age, I remember being terrified of growing up in general and going to school. Like, I didn't want to get older because all my older sisters had homework, and I was terrified of having homework. That just seemed like the worst thing in the world to me, like a complete encroachment on my freedom as a child with very important things to do. So, and then, after doing, K through 12, I don't know, sometimes I look back and then it occurs to me, God, isn't that really strange that we take these little beings and we stick them into these institutions for 8 hours a day or however long it is behind desks and make them sit there and subject them to all of these subjects that Plato's time didn't even exist, sitting in chemistry class, just bored out of my mind, fantasizing about the girl next to me. All of that, like, very coercive. And it's hard. It's not easy to get through that. But we do it because we don't want people to turn out to be complete assholes. We want to shape people into
workers.
Maybe give them a chance of, right?
Compliant workers. We're making them into drones.
That's right. Economic units, perfectly polished economic units. That's what we want. Good citizens, good people. There is an ethical component to this. We do create educational curriculums that are very well defined and include things like chemistry, but exclude other things. And you're right, it's not in the domain of law exactly, but it is in the domain of policy. And I guess there are laws that define curricula in a broad way, federally, right? I don't know a lot about this. And then a lot is defined at a state level or at a local level, even by school boards. But yeah, people have to make these decisions. And it is all about shaping people in part to be a certain kind of citizen so that so that the state can even be viable. If you didn't do it, there wouldn't be a city, there wouldn't be a state. It simply wouldn't be possible if people didn't receive the right education.
And Plato actually seems a little more progressive in terms of a John Dewey-esque education as play. Involve people. Don't just sit them in a desk for 6 or 8 hours and expect them to absorb things. Maybe there was just less things to know, less books, back when Plato was writing. But even so, I feel like he is in on the idea that we are going to be evaluating, right? This is another theme that comes up. We are sort of slaves to a pleasure pain calculation. And so it's education is about aligning that calculation with doing the right thing, of like putting people so that they are rewarded when they do the right thing. And so that, virtue is, per Socrates, normally in the Republic, something that is a pleasure. It's a joy in itself. But we want to actually construct a society to make sure that the bad people are not rewarded, to make sure the good people get the great honors and stuff. So yeah, that's all. We are definitely dealing with the flawed animal that the human being is, instead of just trying to assume that he has the capability of acting like a machine in a learning environment.
And I want to just say a little more about what the flaw is. And this is on page 10. The flaw is that there are these two types of goods. One he calls divine, right? And those are the virtues. And the other are human. So beauty, strength, wealth, and even health. And we tend to prioritize the human things over the divine things. We tend not to see the point of being overly virtuous if, for instance, we can get what we want. And it's very hard to reverse that and convince people that, hey, you're actually going to be happier by focusing on virtue than by focusing on these externalities. I've been studying philosophy for a long time, and even I am not like fully convinced of it. So it's a nice idea, but I don't know at a deep level that I'm fully convinced of it. So the other aspect is, okay, well, if you have a problem that's that hard to solve, because I think it is a very hard problem to solve, how do you do it? And this is page 10 to 11, where he says, essentially, we have to regulate people's effective responses to things. I think, Mark, you were just making this point. Pain, pleasure, desire. We've got to change the configuration of their passions and how they respond to external stimuli. And then how do you do that? And that's where he says, we do that by honoring honoring the good and dishonoring the bad. So there's going to be a lot of honor in doing the virtuous thing and a lot of dishonor in not doing the virtuous thing. And that is going to give us a lot of clues about how to set up our penalties as well later on for crimes.
Yeah. When do you get your time out, and when do you get your attaboy?
Yeah. He does say you shouldn't shame children at one point. So it's not exactly about shaming. He says that you should be more about setting an example and not doing things that are shameful. But it seems like, yeah, it's hard to escape the implication that there's a certain amount of shame involved. And of course, children, often do when they're being reprimanded. They seem to feel shame.
Yeah.
So we did just a little bit of book 2, just to elaborate on some of this, where he, for instance, page 41, you compel the poets to say that the good man, being moderate and just, is happy and blessed, whether he be great or strong, or small and weak, whether he be rich or not. Even if someone is richer than Cinyras or Midas, if he's unjust, he's a wretch and lives a life of misery. So and a lot of the length of this book, I felt like, was repeating basically that kind of thing. It's telling me, the reader, yes, society should steer us all toward virtue. And I feel like maybe in his final draft, he would have tightened this up a little bit.
It does make me pine for the concision of Euthyphro or something like that, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's been criticized for being, and that's why it's so long, and for being disorganized. But yeah, this what he's saying early on in book 2 is that we can habituate children, and again, by the regulation of pleasure and pain, and make them hate what's bad and love what's good. And then he'll say on page 32, education, I say, is the virtue that comes first into being in children. Pleasure and liking, pain and hatred become correctly arranged in the souls of those who are not yet able to reason. And then, when the souls do become capable of reasoning, these passions can, in consonance with reason, affirm that they have been correctly habituated in the appropriate habits. This consonance in its entirety is virtue. And that's very interesting, because we often get a picture in which reason and passion are opposed, and reason has to overcome passion. And it even looks a little bit that way in book 1. We read part with the famous puppet cord analogy, where he compares human beings to puppets who are pulled by two hard iron cords of pleasure and pain, and then one cord which is calculation, and it's kind of gentle and soft. which reminds me, by the way, of Hume's idea that reason is something like a soft, gentle sentiment. But, right, so calculation will tell us what truly is better or worse. So I don't know what to make. It seems a little bit indeterminate or inconsistent. What he does say about calculation is that because it's gentle, it's in need of helpers. And then the question is, well, what do we think the helpers are for calculation? I think, again, it's honor. And this is it echoes something that's said in the Republic, which is that to overcome the passions, reason needs the help of thumos, needs the help of this concept of honor. And then the other obvious answer to that question is early on, right? The helpers are the parents and others who are instilling these virtues from a young age.
Yeah. You want to get your thematic alignment with your reason rather than having it aligned with other things.
Yeah, right. Because he also uses honor. Like people often honor just lines up with all the human goods. People think that that's what's honorable. So when he'll even say love of honor is a vice, but he means it in the sense of, right, I'm being honored because I'm a great this or that, for instance, and because I'm rich or whatever.
I mean, it's hard for me not to think of the conversation with Alcibiades and the interaction with Alcibiades in the Symposium, for instance. And, the Republic also is talked about as a book all about education. And maybe in certain ways, many of the dialogues would be that way. But, in the Symposium, at least, you have the interaction with somebody who becomes a kind of, he's a general and tyrannical kind of ruler. And you have him being affected by Socrates, but there's a kind of failure of Socrates to penetrate into his soul to actually persuade him effectively.
Right. As a warrior, his thematic energy is all turned outwards. And that's the way we began this dialogue, right? Are we turning thumos outwards and against enemies, or can we use it somehow to foster internal cohesion in the psyche?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Well, that seems like a good point to wrap up part 1 with. We will talk about this city that they're going to try to build, and what the laws look like in that city, and specifically how they argue about the existence of God. In our next part, you can become a partially life citizen through our website, through Patreon. That would get you your part 2 right now. If you support us through Apple, or you're not supporting us at all, you'll just see it next week. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.